All right, so we've looked at really the only way that we can display categorical data. Really, a majority of the chapter, what we're going to spend our time on is with quantitative variables. So we're going to look at how we can display them. We're going to look at relationships between them. We're going to do a lot of analyzing and computation. Not the categorical is not important, but we're going to do more with quantitative. So some things with quantitative. Really, the main way to show quantitative variables is with something you've done before, but that's with a scatter plot. And that's kind of what this section focuses on, is making a scatter plot. And today what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how you can do one on a calculator. We'll do them by hand as well, but the calculator is a good method. I'll show you eventually how to do it on like Google Sheets or spreadsheets, things like that. But you've done scatter plots before. It's just now we'll do a little bit more analysis with those. Before we get to that part though, just like we did last time, knowing what the explanatory and the response variables are is going to be important. So you had a couple problems on your homework that asked about explanatory variables. So just kind of following up on that. If I gave you this example and I said, I'm going to look at the square footage of living space in a house and the price in a sample of houses for sale. Well, which of these two things do you think would be the explanatory? In other words, which one would affect the other? Would the living space affect the price? Would the price affect the living space?
I think,
Both one. Okay.
I think the square footage of the living space.
Yeah, probably how big the house is affects how much you're going to be able to sell it for. So in this example, probably the square footage would be our explanatory variable. Not always, sometimes it may be a little different, but in most cases, the bigger the house, the more expensive it's going to be. So if I were graphing that one up here, I would have put this on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis. What about this second one? If we look at the average hours of study time per week and the average hours of extracurricular activities per week for a sample of students, what do you think would affect the other? The number of study time hours, would that affect the extracurricular hours? Would the number of extracurricular hours affect the study time hours? Any ideas? What do you think, Brad? Okay, so maybe the extracurricular activities, if I have a lot of extracurricular activities going on, it's going to affect how much time I have that I can study. All right, so I would say that's probably makes sense. Could I go the other direction? Yeah, maybe I have a lot of extra homework, a lot of extra stuff I have to do, and that's my priority, so now I cut down on some of my extracurricular activities. So this is an example where you couldn't go wrong, because you could probably convince somebody that this is the explanatory. Someone else might be able to convince somebody that this is the explanatory. So there are some situations, not very many, but sometimes there's no definite X and Y. Sometimes they can be flip-flopped and you're still going to be okay. The first one probably not so much, but sometimes the explanatory could actually fit either of the variables. All right, like I said, we're going to do scatter plots here in a second, but once we make a scatter plot, we're also going to have to describe them. So there's 4 ways that we're going to describe a scatter plot. The first way that we're going to display a scatter plot or to describe it is by its direction. So there's basically 2 options here. I may have a scatter plot that looks like this. Where the values as we go from left to right are increasing. That would be considered a positive direction. versus if they're decreasing, then we're looking at a negative. Sometimes that's really easy to figure out. Sometimes it's really easy to see they're going up or they're going down. Other times it's a little more difficult. But when I ask for a description, that's one of the things I'll ask for, is it positive or negative? The second thing that we'll look at is what's called the form of the scatter plot. So one of the forms that the scatter plot could be in is that my values or my dots essentially form a line, or we have a linear situation. Maybe you have a situation where you have something like this, where the values kind of go down and then they go back up. What's that look like? Parabola. So that form would be considered a quadratic. Maybe you have a situation where you kind of have values that are kind of low and then all of a sudden they get a lot higher. Something like that. You might remember what that looks like? Or it was kind of level and then it takes off. Exponential. So these are kind of the three basic forms our scatter plots could be in. In this course, we're going to pretty much focus only on the linear forms. I'd say 99.9% of what we'll do will be linear stuff. Not that the other stuff doesn't exist and it's not important, but just time-wise, that's all we're going to focus on. So I've got direction, I've got form. The third thing is what's referred to as the strength. The strength is going to be based on how close the values are together, or how closely they form, say, a line. So if I have a situation where my values are pretty close together, then I'm going to consider that to have a strength that is labeled as strong. If my values are kind of all over the place, that's going to be the opposite. It's going to be weak. For right now, we're just going to kind of eyeball it and say, okay, it kind of looks like it's close together, so I'll call it strong. Or it looks like it's spread out, so we'll call it weak. By the end of the chapter, though, we'll have a more specific way of doing it. Plus, we'll even break it down to very strong or very weak or maybe moderate. So we'll have categories eventually. But for right now, we're just going to look at it and say, okay, this looks strong, this looks weak. And then the last thing we look at is, do we have any outliers? And we've talked about outliers before, but basically if I looked at a scatter plot and I had all these points maybe in a line, but then I find out I've got this point out here, it's all kind of by itself, that would be our outlier. So it's going to be a point that doesn't fit our model, it doesn't fit everything else that we have. So it's kind of out by itself. So if I ever ask you to describe a scatter plot, I'd be looking for those four things. Which directions it going, what's the form that it's in, its strength, and do we have any outliers? All right, so how are we going to make a scatter plot with some data on our calculators? Well, I gave you some data there related to different types of candy that they might sell in a movie theater. And for each of those types of candy, I have the sugar amount and the calories. And we're going to try to make a scatter plot for this data. So first of all, we've got two variables here. We've got sugar, we've got calories. Which of those two do you think would be the explanatory variable? What do you think, Ben? Yeah, sugar. So the amount of sugar is probably going to affect how many calories we're in. So I would consider this to be the explanatory, this to be the response. Which means when I make my scatter plot, the sugar will be on the x-axis, the calories will be on the y-axis. Well, we're going to enter our data into the calculator really the same way we always have. So I'm going to put all the sugar amounts into L1, and make sure you include these over here as well. So do all these sugar amounts in L1, and then do all the calorie amounts in L2. Okay, so we haven't really done two lists before, but we're going to put this into L1, then put these into L2. But again, include these over here as well. And whenever you're entering the data, and always make sure your last line matches. In other words, don't make sure you didn't have an extra amount in one list versus the other. Like I said, we're going to make a scatter plot. Now the calculator calls it a stat plot. And you'll notice above the y equals, it says stat plot. So to get to that, we're going to hit second, and we're going to hit the y equals button. And you get a picture that looks like that, or a screen that looks like that. Well, we're just going to choose the first one here. So plot one. So go ahead and hit enter. And so we got to do a few things on this page. The first thing we got to do is turn on the stat plot. So where it says on, we'll just hit enter. There's actually a lot of different graphs you can do with the stat plots. We're gonna do the first one, the one that looks like there's a bunch of dots on there. Some of these others, this is actually a histogram that we could have done on there. And these were box plots. We could have done box plot from there as well, but we're doing that scatter plot, the first one. Then it talks about the X list and the Y list. Well, remember we put the X list or the explanatory in L1. So make sure it says X list L1. Does anybody's not say L1? Okay, if you ever need to change it, remember you just hit the second button and then whatever number you want. So if you want L1, you hit second one. Make sure the Y list says L2. And then the mark, that's just what you want your dots to look like. You want it to look like a square or a cross, a little point. That's up to you. All right, well, if I tried to graph this now, say I looked at mine and I tried to graph it. I'm not going to see anything yet. And that's because it's not showing the values that I wanted to work with here. So we have to change this a little bit. We're going to use what's called the window button to tell it basically what values I want to look at. So our X values, remember, were the sugar. So with the sugar values, our lowest value was like, what, 44-ish? Is that the lowest? Yeah, it was 44. But what I'm going to do, since I don't have any negatives, usually we want to set our minimum at 0, unless I happen to have negatives. So where it says X minimum, I'm going to put 0 in there. The X maximum, what was the largest amount of sugar I had?
107.
107, was that the most from both of them? Oh, we had 136 over here. So I want to choose a value that's bigger than 136. So I'm going to go up to 150. If I'm going from 0 to 150, what might be a good scale? Good interval. You want to go by tens? So I'm going to make the X scale 10. For the Y's, again, I didn't go in the negative, so I'm going to make my minimum 0. What was our largest calorie amount? 790. So I'm going to go a little higher than that, so I'll go up to 800. What's a good scale for 0 to 800? Go by hundreds. And if you ever don't like it, you can always come back and change it. All right, so if I set up my window like this, go ahead and hit graph after you set it up like that. And now, hopefully, we do have a plot. Now, does anybody have any extra lines or something on there? Okay, if you have extra lines, that probably means there's an equation entered. So if you go to y equals, you just hit clear on any equations. And then if you hit graph again, it should pop back up. All right, well, here's what I want you to do. We've got this graph now. I want you to see if you can describe the graph by the 4 things we talked about. We talked about direction, form, strength. Do we have outliers? See if you could answer those 4 things about that scatter plot. And if your scatter plot didn't work on the calculator, I'll look at it and see what happens.
I only have like 5, 6 of them.
Oh, yeah, I think you want to get this side.
Oh, I think I did.
Maybe that side as well.
Oh, so you have to use that.
Yeah, so since they had it set up in 2 things, we had to
Okay.
look at.
Okay, I was thinking we had to put the other section on this one.
Oh, I see what you did. No, so what I wanted was this.
Oh, so that's why it's L2.
Because all the L1s are going to be sugar.
Not really. You go. Oh, yeah. That's yeah, I see. Okay. Oh. Did you stop them? Did you stop them?
No, I kept put stuff in
That's why.
the bed when
You still do.
What's our direction there? Yeah, positive, as we're going from left to right, this one wasn't too bad to read, you can see they're going up. Which kind of makes sense, the more sugar that you have in the candy, then the more calories you're gonna have. What about our form here? Yeah, it's pretty linear. It's not in an exact line, but I could fit a line pretty well to this. If I try to put a line through here. It fits my data fairly well on that. What about strength on this one?
Weak.
Okay, weak. It's actually not awfully weak, but it may be a little bit weak because it's a little bit spread out. If you said strong, I'd be okay with that too because it's not like they're totally spread out other than this one out here. So either one I'd be okay with. You said weak, so I'll go with weak. The nice thing, like I said, is we'll have a different way of deciding that later on. Any outliers? Yeah. Look like this one kind of not by itself. Which one was that? This one was a lot higher on one. Yeah, the peanut M&Ms look like it was the highest one. So it looked like we did have an outlier there with peanut M&Ms. All right, so it kind of gives you an idea of what you might do with the scatter plots. Like I said, sometimes we'll do it on the calculator, sometimes we'll do it by hand. Other times we may even use the spreadsheet for that. And that's basically what 2.2 talks about. We'll hold off on any problems for 2.2 until next week. We'll do some more with that.